Hey all, Forge here. Welcome back to my channel. We've got a special guest today, which you can see the top of his head. This is Monty. He's a sleepy boy and he's a little shy, so we'll just let him sit in his box on my lap, which is his favorite place to take a nap. Today, I'm super excited because we're talking about Edge of Eternity, the newest set to Magic the Gathering, and one that I think I am more excited for than I have been for a set in a long while. So what I've done today is I've compiled a list of about 50 cards that I think are either really cool and have a chance to, bring out new strategies and interesting brews, or are just powerful cards that may see play in decks that are already strong and consistent archetypes in the format. Now, before we jump into looking at cards, I do want to take a moment to talk about upload schedules for the channel going forward. Just because I like to be transparent about this stuff, and saying it out loud to you guys helps me solidify it as well in my head. So basically, when it comes to recording, I have 2 days that I can sort of easily record without any interruptions or issues. And that's Tuesdays and Fridays. So my goal in the long run is to have videos come out probably on Wednesdays or Saturdays. Obviously, I'm kind of new to this. I've put out YouTube videos in the past, but nothing with this level of attempted consistency. So I'm probably going to stumble here and there. For instance, this video I was thinking of putting out on Wednesday, but I didn't realize that we were already almost all the way through spoiler season, so I decided to wait until Saturday, basically, to put this video out, so that I could take a look at the whole set. For now, the goal is 2 videos a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays, although I may or may not miss that goal, depending on, if I have an idea for a video that falls through, or, just real life stuff happening. But anyways, let's move on to cards. Well, the auto feeder went off and we lost Monty. But anyways, the first card we're going to take a look at today is Anti-Causal Vestige. This is a 6-mana, 7/5 Eldrazi creature that says when this creature leaves the battlefield, draw a card, then you may put a permanent card with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. Which is an insane line of text, by the way. But the big thing about this is that it warps in for 4 mana. And that's, you may cast this card from your hand for its warp cost, exile this creature at the beginning of the next end step, then you may cast it from exile on a later turn. It's almost like a pseudo, evoke meets adventure kind of deal. Now, I don't necessarily know that this is something that's going to see play in the main board of a lot or even many decks at all. However, there is one specific case that I think it's going to be very relevant, and something that the first thing I thought of when I looked at this, which is sneaking large-costed non-creature permanents past Dovin's veto, while also potentially holding up interaction. I know myself, I'm playing, currently my brew is a Temur landfall sort of deck that relies on casting Dragonback Assault, which is a 6-mana non-creature permanent, and then on a following turn, casting Scapeshift to get a ton of dragons. And when I'm up against control, consistently I have a problem resolving that because it costs me 6 whole mana, and I cannot often pay for No More Lies, or, Dovin's veto just says counter target non-creature permanent. And I could see this, casting it for 4, perhaps on 7 lands, means that I can hold up mana for No More Lies. It will enter, it will leave, because even if as long as it enters, it doesn't matter if it warps out or if my opponent removes it, you're getting the trigger to draw a card and put a permanent card into play. There are lots of different applications you can get with this, but I think for the most part, when it comes to seeing Pioneer play, it would be as a sideboard card to try and sort of get around control decks. And that's mostly the spot that it's going to occupy in my brews, unless we see some strong reason for Eldrazi synergy. Alright, the next card we're going to look at is Tezzeret Cruel Captain. This is a 3-mana Planeswalker with no color, so you can play him in any deck, basically. He enters with 4 loyalty. He has a passive that says whenever an artifact you control enters, put a loyalty counter on Tezzeret. He zeros to untap target artifact or creature. If it's an artifact creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can -3 to search your library for an artifact card with mana value 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And he ultimates at -7 with you get an emblem that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, put 3 +1/+1 counters on target artifact you control. If it's not a creature, it becomes a 0/0 robot artifact creature. My first read of this card says that it goes crazy in Golgari Food, or I guess Jund's Sacrifice as well, but I think the food-oriented list probably utilizes this a bit better. The reason for that is that food lists are often playing Gilded Goose as food token generators. They're also playing Scavenger's Talent, which creates food when you sacrifice things. Tezzeret's -3 also gives you an ideal way to find Witch's Oven, which you can, assuming it's turn 4, you can then play immediately to get Tezzeret's loyalty back up to 2, and then activate to sacrifice something, and potentially bring his loyalty back up to 3. And if you have a Scavenger's Talent in play, 4, because you'll notice Tezzeret's passive says whenever an artifact. It does not say non-token artifact. And I have played plenty of games against Golgari Food where they have 1, 2, sometimes even 3 copies of Scavenger's Talent in play, and 1 activation of a Witch's Oven puts 4 loyalty counters on this Planeswalker, which is crazy. I can absolutely see turns where you play Tezzeret in that list and can ultimate him that turn, which turns every food that you create off of Scavenger's Talent or Witch's Oven into potentially a 3/3 artifact creature. And that really significantly sort of increases the efficacy of the mid-range backup plan that those decks rely on when they can't find Igra, Eater of All, or if you have enough life gain to get out of the sort of drain zone that comes from repeatedly casting and reanimating Cauldron Familiar. But beyond that, I also think that this offers a very strong reason to start messing around with just artifact flavor brews in general. There are a number of things that are in this set that create lander tokens, which are great. We've got, creatures like Spyglass Siren that create map tokens, Voldarin Epicure that creates the blood tokens. In white, we've got the Novice Investigator and Thraben Inspector that create the clue tokens. All of these are 1 mana ways to create a artifact token that puts loyalty counters on Tezzeret and gets you closer to that ultimate. It also gives you a way to find, again, 1-cost artifacts, which is fantastic when we're talking about sideboard artifacts. There are a lot of very relevant sideboard artifacts that you may only play 2 of in your sideboard, and then, you really need to find them. Against Control, Pithing Needle is very strong. Against graveyard-based strategies, Soul Guide Lantern exists. There are more that I know I'm forgetting about. But there are also just really strong 1-mana artifacts in general that can be the core game plan for a lot of decks. So I think this card not only fits very well into existing decks that see play, but also provides a huge reason to start experimenting with cards that, artifact cards that cost 1 mana. Next up is Cosmogranda Zenith. This is a 3-mana, 2 generic, 1 white, 2/4 human soldier. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, choose 1. Create 2 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This card is crazy. I've seen some people in my local play group joking around that this is Corey Steelcutter Part 2. I don't necessarily think that it's at that level of power. There are a lot of reasons why this doesn't give prowess tokens, for example. However, I do think the fact that this is a human that also makes humans means that this is particularly good in humans lists in general, and notably, it is not legendary. I could see playing a couple copies of this alongside Adeline Resplendent Cathar. I don't think that this card replaces it at all, but I do think that you could potentially see this played alongside it. If you play this the turn after Adeline, followed by any 1-drop, you are not only creating two 1/1 tokens to make Adeline's power higher, or you could just put +1/+1 counters on everything if you've got, already a strong board. This, in many cases, humans, if it's not interacted with, already has really, really scary plays of 1/2/3. 1 mana, 2/1 like a recruitment officer, I believe, which is a 2/1 into Thalia, into Adeline, can often be backbreaking for reactive decks. Now imagine that you're in one of those reactive decks on the play. Your 4 mana sweeper now costs 5, or your temporary lockdown now costs 4. And so you can't play it on your turn 3. You pass, the humans player on their turn 4 plays this and a 1-drop and puts a 1/1 counter on all of those creatures. That is often enough, or could often be enough, to instantly guarantee lethal. In other situations, perhaps, when you've already, you survived the initial rush, you've cast a board wipe, your opponent, or the humans player, is sort of rebuilding their board, this is an incredible way to do that. Oftentimes they will already, if you've resolved the board wipe, they now probably have 4 lands. At least, when I play against humans, they absolutely do. And so being able to cast this, and then a 1-drop, now they have 4 creatures on the board. If you can't deal with them right away, their following turn, maybe they cast Athalia's Lieutenant. All of those things get +1/+1. Maybe if they cast Athalia's Lieutenant and another thing, maybe they're putting 2 1/1 counters on their entire board that turn. And that's multiple 3/3s. This becomes a 5-power creature, or sorry, a 4-power creature. It just seems very, very strong. I could also see this in a number of decks that care about going wide, because this both goes wide and pumps the thing, pumps your board when it's already wide. And in reactive decks that have, instant speed removal spells, notably this does not say 2 spells during your turn, it says each turn. So you could potentially cast 2 removal spells on your opponent's turn and create 2 1/1s, or put, counters on your entire board. To me, this is an extremely flexible and strong card that, as a 3-drop, has a really, really solid body. 2/4. We've seen this in other cards that have seen play. Preacher of the Schism, for example. 4 toughness is a notable butt that blocks very well. And that's very relevant in a format that oftentimes has to deal with hasted, 3-power creatures swinging at you very early and consistently. So I think this is a fantastic card overall that has a lot of potential in Pioneer. Next up, we're looking at Focus Fire. This is a 1 mana, 1 white instant. Focus Fire deals X damage to target attacking or blocking creature, where X is 2 plus the number of creatures and or spacecraft you control. This is 1 mana. This is the closest thing to a Lightning Bolt that I think you're going to find for white mid-range decks, and can be very, very strong in specifically the mono-white tokens list, where you very likely have 1, 2, 3, often even 4 tokens on the board that your opponent doesn't really feel the need to deal with right away, because they're like walls from the Birth of Melithus, or, a 1/1 rabbit token. Each of those takes this from being a shock to a lightning bolt, or, potentially even a lava axe, or lightning axe that you don't have to discard for. Granted, the restriction that it has to be an attacking or blocking creature is kind of rough, But we already see, the Wandering Emperor sees a lot of play, and granted, there's a lot more. The Wandering Emperor obviously does tons of things more than its -2 of exiling a tapped creature, and tapped creatures are a lot easier to, interact with than specifically attacking and blocking creatures. But I do think that this provides a really solid piece of removal for these mono white token lists that, on turn 3, you can play a Carrot Cake and hold this up and deal 3 damage to an attacking creature, which is very relevant. And even on an empty board, this is a shock. And that's, if you've done nothing and your opponent attacks with a Blood Tithe Harvester, this is a way to deal with it, even if you've just been board wiped and have nothing else going on. Next up, we've got Lightstall Inquisitor. This is 1 white for a 2/1 Angel Wizard with Vigilance. When this creature enters, each opponent exiles a card from their hand and may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. Each spell cast this way costs 1 more to cast, and each land played this way enters tapped. We've seen a lot of these taxi effects that still allow the opponent to play them. Off the top of my head, recently we've had Aven Interrupter, we've got Invasion of Gobakhan, going back to Strixhaven, there's Elite Spellbinder. Not a lot of these see too much play. Invasion of Gobakhan often is a sideboard card for aggressive white decks. Aven Interrupter saw play in the Selesnya Coco lists that were popular before Corey Steelcutter and Mice, took over the format. The reason that I'm so high on this card is the creature type. Right now, in this era of hyper aggro, Angels is very strong. I mean, if I remember correctly, it is the 6th most played deck in Pioneer right now. And being able to have a 1 mana Angel that is relevant is huge. Oftentimes, I think Angel players either will play an Elf on 1 or do nothing. And having this card in the list as, an additional 1-drop, maybe not as a 4 of, but maybe as a 2 of, allows them to have lines that are this on turn 1, Giada on turn 2, and then Righteous Valkyrie on 3, with the Giada trigger makes that enter not as a 2/4, but as a 4/6 on turn 3, which is very, very good when you consider that any further Angels that enter give them life gain triggers that will then activate Righteous Valkyrie's passive and potentially wind up in a 6/8 Righteous Valkyrie that is pretty hard to deal with if you're not in black, or I guess white, with Get Lost. Not to mention, if your opponent had to mulligan, this is such a punishing card. Even though they get to pick, this means that maybe they can't curve out properly. Maybe they've kept a couple of things that need to get played on turns 1 and 2, and now they can't. Or maybe they exile the land, and then they draw into a 3-drop that they need, but that 3rd land is going to enter tapped, and they can't cast it on curve. I think this is a fantastic piece of interaction that the Angels decks don't usually get access to. I also, outside of the Angels list, we're seeing more and more of these. Sort of exile it and it costs a little bit more later. I think we're getting closer and closer to a new age Death and Taxes list that is able to play a number of cards that are disrupting their opponent, and then sort of hold that tempo advantage for long enough to get over the finish line before their opponent can really develop their game plan. Obviously, it's a struggle right now when we consider that the best decks are playing, the Mice package and Corey Steelcutter that can invalidate blocking and just go so fast. But hopefully, if Pioneer gets the stewardship that it deserves, we will see that change over time, and I think that this could, in the future, be a core part of a, sort of a aggressive but taxi strategy where you play this into Thalia, into Elite Spellbinder, or hold up Aven Interrupter, something of that nature. Alright, next up we've got Lumen Class Frigate. This is a 2-mana spacecraft. It stations for, at 2+, other creatures you control get +1/+1, And at 12 plus, it has flying, lifelink, and is a 3/5. This, I think, is a really interesting anthem, basically. Right now, the only other anthem of this effect that you can play in 2 mana is restricted to Selesnya colors that is printed in Foundations. And I don't necessarily know that 2 mana anthems are like super great or anything. This could work very well in tokens lists where you're creating a lot of small tokens. Curving this into a wedding announcement, you're going to be able to station this quite quickly. And, it's already pretty dangerous when that wedding announcement flips and you've got 6/6 power on the board. Imagine if you're using those to station this frigate along the way. Now you've got 9 power on the board after 3 turns of wedding announcement. So I think it's quite powerful and could see play in those token lists. I don't know how well it fits into like a really aggressive list, because ideally, if you're playing a really aggressive aggro strategy, you play a Savannah Lions on 1, you want to attack with it on 2. You want to play a creature on turn 2 that's going to attack on turn 3. You don't want to go Savannah Lions on 1, play this, station it, move to turn 3, play something. At that point, your Savannah Lions has probably died to removal. It's turn 3 and you've done no damage to your opponent. Doesn't really fit the game plan of an aggro deck, but I think there's a lot of potential for this as an anthem effect in tokens lists that, in the longer term, can become a pseudo threat on its own. I mean, 3/5 isn't the best, but if you're in a grindy game, I could see, flying lifelink. It's got potential. Okay, next we're talking about Pinnacle Star Cage. This is a 3 mana artifact, 1 generic and 2 white. When this artifact enters, exile all artifacts and creatures with mana value 2 or less until this artifact leaves the battlefield. You can also activate this for 8 mana, 6 generic and 2 white. Put each card exiled with this artifact into its owner's graveyard, then create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token for each card put into a graveyard this way. Sacrifice this artifact. I think in most cases you're probably going to play temporary lockdown over this. However, there are some interesting things here because this does not itself hit enchantments. It only hits creatures and artifacts. That means that in these sort of like 5-color value piles that play up the beanstalk and nowhere to run, these low-costed 2-mana enchantments with powerful passive effects, you can play this very easily to deal with your opponent's creatures and artifacts without also compromising your ability to draw cards by playing overlords and the like. So I think this is pretty interesting. So I think it's nice because it provides options. It's an alternative to temporary lockdown with different positives and negatives that has synergies with different strategies overall. And, if you ever do have 8 mana, you could potentially make 6-8 power worth of bodies at instant speed on your opponent's end step, potentially as a way to close out the game. Alright, next I want to take a look at reroute systems. We're not going to spend too much time on this one. I just thought it was really interesting and cool. We see a lot of these 1 mana, no, your removal spell isn't going to work effects. But it's rare, I think, that we see modal ones, especially modal ones that are also fairly decent removal spells. The ability to use it both offensively and defensively is a huge boon to this card. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. I think it could slot into a lot of these decks that want to play these 1 mana protection spells, but that could also benefit from dealing 2 damage to an opponent's creature. This next one, though, is huge. This is Seam Rip. It is a 1 mana enchantment. When this enchantment enters, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less until this enchantment leaves the battlefield. This is functionally exactly the same as Portable Hole. It is just an enchantment. That's already fantastic. Like we were just talking about with the temporary lockdown 2, this is that, This is Portable Hole, except it's an enchantment. Portable Hole already sees play in a ton of decks. Oftentimes, decks that care about enchantments. And so, Seam Rip can either be additional copies of Portable Hole, potentially in fast metas where those decks need this effect, Or, for decks like Enigmatic Incarnation, this provides portable Hull, but that allows them to sacrifice this card later on to Enigmatic Incarnation and tutor for a 2-drop creature. And I don't believe that Enigmatic lists currently play a 1-cost enchantment that they can sacrifice. So this potentially allows them to add an additional layer of toolbox to their already quite strong toolbox deck that allows them to find any number of 2-mana, solutions to problems. And I think that's really cool. And again, it's just providing alternative options where we only before had an artifact. Well, now we have an enchantment, and that matters when it comes to building decks that might care about those types. Alright, moving on into blue. This is one of the cards that I've rated highest so far from this set, and that is Consult the Star Charts. It is a 2-mana instant, 1 and a blue, with Kicker, 1 and a blue. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of lands you control. Put one of those cards into your hand. If this spell was kicked, put 2 of those cards into your hand instead. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This, I think, is fantastic, and is probably the best 4-mana draw spell that we've seen since Memory Deluge, I would say. And in a lot of ways, this is preferable to Memory Deluge. And that's because, again, it has flexibility. Sure, when you cast this for 4, it's like slightly worse Memory Deluge. You're not going to be able to cast it again later, so on, whatever. Who cares? The thing about this is that you can also cast it for 2 mana. And I've seen people say, like, guys, come on, this isn't that good. Most of the time, it's just worse Impulse. And it's like, sure. But sometimes you're playing blue-white control, and you're just running into bad luck. Oftentimes you're playing a Yorion pile, which suffers from a higher degree of variance due to playing 80 cards. Maybe you're sitting there on turn 3 with 3 lands on the field, no lands in hand, knowing that you need to cast Supreme Verdict next turn. This lets you look at the next 3 cards and try and find your land drop. You cannot do that with Memory Deluge, and I know that there are control players watching this video who have been in that situation on turn 3, staring down a lethal board with a Supreme Verdict and a Memory Deluge in hand, going, ah, shit. I don't know if this replaces Memory Deluge, or if it replaces Deduce, or if it replaces neither. All I know is that this is an incredibly flexible card that is going to see play. Outside of established lists, I've already talked about my Temur, Landfall Brew. This card is crazy for that. Because it has this where X is the number of lands you control, I often find in that deck that I have 10, 12, 15 lands in play and no cards in hand. And being able to pull this, cast it for 4, look at the top 15 cards of my library and pick the 2 most relevant, and then still have 11 mana accessible to cast my spells. This card is incredible, and I think it's going to see a lot of play in primarily control lists, but also I'm going to play the shit out of it in my Temur Brew. Next up is Cryogen Relic. 2 mana for an artifact. When this artifact enters or leaves the battlefield, draw a card. Then you can also pay 2 mana to sacrifice the artifact and put a stun counter on up to 1 target tapped creature. Basically, this is Ichor Wellspring with upside. I think this card is great. ETB, you're paying 2 mana to draw a card. Leaves the battlefield, by any method, draw a card. I kind of have been thinking about this as like a sorcery speed Deduce, with the added upside of, if you are playing a Yorion deck, being able to bounce this draws you 2 cards. Now, in a control aspect, you're probably not going to play this over Omen of the Sea or Deduce because of the instant speed. But if you are playing a value deck that doesn't, you're not trying to hold up mana for counter spells, you're just trying to play cards, draw cards, get value, this is insane. Any effect that flickers this is drawing you multiple cards. You even get some tempo if you need it by being able to sacrifice this and put stun counters on a threat that you can't deal with yet. I mean, just like random scenarios that pop into my head, doing this and targeting a I mean, even just random scenarios popping in my head, sacrificing this to put a stun counter at instant speed on an attacking unstoppable slasher and then casting your removal spell means that it's gone for good. So there are a lot of ways that I think this is a flexible card. I think it comes down to how much does the artifact type matter, and is there a deck that doesn't care about playing instant speed that can flicker this later on down the line and can benefit from the tempo you get from the sacrifice effect. Next, we're looking at Disculpting Blast, which is a 2-mana instant, 1 in a blue. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If it was attacking, create a 1/1 colorless drone artifact creature token with flying, and this token can block only creatures with flying. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this card. I just thought it was a really neat interaction. It's slightly more expensive than Into the Floodmaw, but it always hits non-land permanents, and if it is a creature, you are getting a 1/1 that flies. And I think that's incredibly strong in a lot of these tempo decks, like Azorius Flash, aka Spirits, potentially even in Dimir Control. You know, the decks that are playing things like Enduring Curiosity or, the Enchantment, Curiosity Enchantment that you attack and draw cards when you deal combat damage. Anything where you could really benefit a lot from just like having a 1/1 flyer, protecting that 1/1 flyer, and just tempoing your opponent out while you swing them down 1 to 2 damage at a time. This, I think, is fantastic because you're going to delay your opponent's threat a turn, and if it's a creature that's attacking, you're getting a guy that you can then protect and get damage in and draw cards. All of these things, fantastic. I don't know that it necessarily sees play. It is 2 mana compared to 1 for Into the Floodmaw, but I do think it provides a decent alternative, especially when you're playing those decks into removal-heavy opponents. Next, we're talking Emissary Escort. This is 2 mana, 1 in a blue for an artifact creature, 0/4. This creature gets +X/+0, where X is the greatest mana value among other artifacts you control. I think this is probably very strong in one specific deck, and that is Azorius Simulacrum Synthesizer, where you're playing a lot of high-costed artifacts, and potentially even Metalwork Colossus. Granted, this is just going to be a vanilla beater, but I don't see it being that difficult to get this guy to like 6, 7, 8, or higher power, depending on the artifacts that you're playing in that deck. And the fact that even if you have nothing else on turn 2, he is a 0/4, means that he blocks these aggressive red strategies extremely well. Next up, we're looking at Starfield Vocalist. This is 4 mana, 3 in a blue for a human bard that is a 3/4. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And here's the thing that makes it so good. It warps for 2 mana. This card is crazy. I think a lot of people are going to read this as, oh, it's just another Panharmonicon and it's a creature, so it gets removed, yada yada. When I see this card, I don't think of, oh, I'm going to play this and have big value and double all my stuff. I am thinking of one deck, and one deck in particular, and that is Simic Scapeshift with Tifa and Mossborn Hydra. Being able to play, like, if you have a Mossborn Hydra on the field on turn 3, being able to play this on turn 4 for 2 mana, and then play a land, like, any of the new Capenna lands that sack immediately upon entering the battlefield, or even a Fabled Passage, you are going to get 4 power doubling triggers. And if I'm remembering my stack, ordering properly, if you play this for the warp cost, it resolves. Your opponent cannot react to it until you have at least played your land. So you will at least get 1 doubled trigger out of this, which means even through a removal spell, you are getting an additional trigger from your sack fetch, which can be, I mean, granted, in this scenario, I think your opponent probably just removes your Mossborn Hydra rather than this. But still, that means that this is, going to stick around for the rest of the turn. It's going to go into warp and you can recast it later. There is a lot to be said for this card being able to warp it in for 2 mana and have an explosive turn, especially in these decks that are doubling the power of their things. Next is Synthesizer Lab Ship. This is a 1 mana artifact spacecraft. It stations for 2+ at the beginning of combat on your turn. Up to 1 other target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 2/2 and gains flying until end of turn. And then, of course, you can station it to 9+ and it becomes a 4/4 flying vigilance. But frankly, I don't think you ever do that because it opens this up to more removal. I think you play this on turn 1. At some point in the future, station it to 2, and then play a defensive tempo game while a map token kills your opponent turn after turn. Not to mention, this is not legendary, so you can play it as multiples, and this one will give you a 2/2 that immediately can station the next one, which then gives you 2 2/2 artifacts every single turn. This is an incredible finisher, I think, for reactive counterspell decks that really just want to say draw go, except your draw go is now draw, attack you with my map token, and then go. And that's not even talking about any potential for artifacts matter decks that care about creating a whole bunch of them, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think this card is so flexible that I would be shocked if we don't see some sort of archetype build up around it. Moving into the black cards, we've got Alfariel Stone Chosen. 5 mana, 3 generic, 2 black for a 3/3 legendary human cleric. With Ward, discard a card at random. And then he also has Void, which is basically Revolt, but it triggers off of warp cards as well. That says, whenever Alfariel attacks, if you voided this turn, defending player loses half their life rounded up. Now, let's be fair. I don't think this is a very good or competitive card. I wanted to talk about it more so because I want to complain. As a sort of old Magic player, this is the kind of design that I really dislike, that we've seen a lot more of in like recent sets, where it's got a kind of difficult to interact with ward costs. Discard a card at random is surprisingly punishing. On turn 5 against a mono blacklist, you may not have another card in hand, so you just literally can't remove this. Or maybe you do have cards in hand, but the discard a card at random means that you can't pick the worst card in your hand to discard. You could discard a core functional card, and discarding that card to this loses you the game in the long run. And I also just really don't like these effects that say like, oh, lose half your life. Not because they're easily abusable or anything, but more so because I don't think there's very good counterplay in these sorts of mechanics. It's like, if it hits you even one time, by the way, it doesn't have to hit you, I'm sorry, it's when he attacks. But if it triggers even once, like you're paying a massive price, and there's just, it feels like there's not a good way to interact with it. So we'll move on from this. I just wanted to highlight it. I don't think this is a good card. I don't think it's going to see a lot of play in competitive lists or anything. But I do think that I'm going to lose to this card out of nowhere, like at the beginning of an arena ladder reset when I'm still in like low silver or something, because I've run out of cards and it's like, oops, I win, and that's the kind of thing that just makes my blood boil. I don't know about you. I'm probably just, being a big grumper here. But anyways, let's move on. Next up, we're looking at Arch Enemy's Charm. This is 3 black for an instant. Choose one. Exile target creature or planeswalker. Return 1 or 2 target creature and or planeswalker cards from your graveyard to your hand. Or put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. It gains lifelink until end of turn. So Arch Enemy's Charm is a continuation of a cycle that we didn't even know we were getting, which is Arch X's Charm, the previous being Archdruid's Charm. Sadly, I don't really think this holds a candle to Archdruid's Charm, and that's because the modal effects that you get from this card are nowhere near the power level of the modal effects that we were getting from Archdruid's Charm. Archdruid's Charm allowed for you to tutor any land to the battlefield, fight something, or remove an artifact or enchantment. And that's really strong because you're not only getting a rare effect. There are plenty of cards that tutor lands to the battlefield, but they're usually basic lands, and they're, for the most part, at sorcery speed. Whereas Archdruid's Charm allows you to tutor any land, which we've seen to tremendous effect in Lotus Field combo lists. But then also, you cannot overstate how good it is to play a modal card that has a effect on it that is usually relegated to sideboard cards. That being the, exile a artifact or enchantment. This kind of has neither of those. All of these effects are things that you see frequently on other black cards at a much better rate, and I don't think combining them into one card at a worse rate with a relatively difficult casting cost makes this powerful enough to see play in Pioneer. Forge and Monty in the middle of the video here to say please like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Doing so helps me a lot as a small channel and helps other people see these videos and hopefully creates a larger community for advocating for Pioneer. Thanks. Next up we're going to look at Faller's Faithful, which is a 3-mana 3/1 human wizard. When this creature enters, destroy up to one other target creature. If that creature wasn't dealt damage this turn, its controller draws 2 cards. This is an interesting one, because it's sort of like a Ravenous Chupacabra effect for a mana cheaper, with the downside of giving your opponents cards, which is like super bad, let's be clear. However, the reason that I've been thinking so much about this card is because it's not restricted to creatures your opponents control. This basically lets you cast a Deadly Dispute at sorcery speed, and instead of getting a treasure token, you get an additional body. Now, the downside here is that you don't trigger sacrifice-specific effects. However, if you're playing any sort of Aristocrats cards that care about your creatures dying, I think this card is actually really crazy, and I think in many ways is better than Deadly Dispute, purely because it leaves an additional body on the field that you can sacrifice to something else while also drawing you cards. Granted, a lot of the better sacrifice effects we've seen lately do also apply to artifacts. But I just think that this is an interesting one. 3 mana for 3/1 isn't a great rate. You'd probably rather play any number of other things at 3 mana, if you're even playing that many 3 mana cards at all. I mean, really, in a dedicated Aristocrats list, you're probably just playing Sephiroth. But you really can't deny the fact that, oh, I'm gonna destroy my Hunted Witness, get a 1/1 Spirit token, draw 2 cards, and make you lose a life, and I'll gain a life. That seems pretty strong, especially when you consider that you now have a 3/1 that you can destroy later or sacrifice to, Bartolomeo, and, get some value out of it from there. So I think it's interesting. I might try it out in some of my own Aristocrats brews, maybe as a 1 or a 2 of. I think ultimately you probably would rather just play Deadly Dispute, but I think that the fact that this is here provides us with an interesting option. Next up is Hymn of the Faller. This is 2 mana for a sorcery. Surveil 1, then you draw a card and lose 1 life. But if you voided this turn, you draw an additional card. I think this is probably the best Sign in Blood that we have seen printed so far. Voiding is not difficult. There are plenty of ways to get treasure tokens, cast other warp spells, so on and so forth. I don't know that there are a lot of decks in Pioneer that want to play sorcery speed card draw in black, but I have, in the past, brewed up some Orzhov tap-out Super Friends lists where, I wanted some 2 mana card draw even if it was at sorcery speed, and this is a great way to get that. So, I might try one of those lists again and see how it went, because previously I was playing Sign and Blood. That costs 2 black mana and you're losing 2 life. But this essentially lets you look at 3 cards and only lose 1 life. And I think that's really good. Alright, next up we're looking at Sunset Saboteur, which is a cracked 2-drop. This is 2 mana for a 4/1 menace. With Ward, discard a card. Whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and opponent controls. This card is absolutely nuts. Granted, the downside is pretty bad, but 4/1 menace with Ward, discard a card is incredibly strong, especially when you consider that in many matchups, your opponents are not going to have any creatures to put these 1/1 counters on. If you're playing against control, if you're running Fatal Push, if you go turn 2 this, your opponent on turn 2 plays a Blood Tithe Harvester, and you go turn 3, Fatal Push your guy, attack, they're not getting any 1/1 counters from this. And 4 damage menace is so good, even when you consider that if you don't have a removal spell for your opponent's creatures right then and there, if they only have one guy, it doesn't matter if you're putting a 1/1 counter on it. It's not blocking this because it has menace. There are so many ways that this guy is going to get in for 4 damage and have 0 downsides, let alone potentially even 8 damage. I mean, if he swings twice, that's almost half of your opponent's life total gone if they don't have a way to remove it or block it. To me, this is a clear inclusion in any aggressive black deck that you would probably just sideboard out against creature-heavy opponents. But in game ones, against someone who's not prepared for it, this is a legitimate threat that is going to get in for damage, or 2-for-1 your opponent, at least. Similar in vein to the last card we looked at, Timeline Color is another aggressive black creature. This is 2 mana, 2 black for a 2/2 Drix Warlock with haste. You may cast this card from your graveyard using its warp ability. It warps for 1 black mana and 2 life, which is so easy to do. There are already aggressive black aggro strategies that are playing Tenacious Underdog because it blitzes for 4 and 2 life. Being able to warp this out of your graveyard for 1 and 2 life is just insane, especially because when you play the Tenacious Underdog, you sack it, then you have to pay 4 mana and 2 life the following turn. With Timeline Color, he warps into exile, and then you cast him for 2 the next turn, and you don't have to pay the life, and he still has haste. I think there are some incredible lines in Pioneer with this card, especially when you're playing it in the same deck as Cecil from the Final Fantasy set, where you're already wanting to lose life to flip him. Not to mention, that deck already sees lines of play that involve playing Cecil on 1, then playing a Mox Amber, and then another 1-drop, whether it be a Thoughtseize or something else. Being able to play Cecil, play Mox Amber, tap it for black, warp this guy from your hand for 2 life, get in for 2, and then on your turn 2, cast him from exile, and get in for potentially 4 damage when your opponent may have only played a tap land. They're now down to 14. That is such a strong line for an aggressive blacklist that to me, there is no way that this does not immediately become a 4 of in the Cecil deck. We're going to look at Umbral Collar Zealot. This is 2 mana for a 3/2 human cleric that says sacrifice another creature or artifact, surveil 1. This is very similar to the 2 mana Orzhov legend from Aetherdrift, but notably it's not legendary, which is significantly better, and it's not white-black in the casting cost, which means it is much easier to cast on turn 2. I think this is an auto-include in any Aristocrats deck that you're going to play. It's an unconditional sacrifice effect that you can do multiple times per turn that you surveil each time. If you're playing a deck that is thinking about playing Raise the Past, which is a super strong 4 mana card from Foundations that returns all creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you play a deck whose curve tops out at 2 plus Raise the Past with this guy, not only are you triggering any aristocrat effects like life drain, you're also getting to surveil more creatures into your graveyard to fuel a future Raise the Past. And, any other value that you're getting. To me, this is probably one of the best sacrifice outlets that we've seen printed in recent times. Thinking about brewing an Aristocrats list, I think this becomes an automatic 4-of as the sacrifice outlet alongside Cartel Aristocrat, because there is just so much upside to surveilling when you sacrifice a creature. Moving into red, we're looking at Invasive Maneuvers. This is 2 mana, 1 in a red for an instant, that deals 3 damage to target creature, but it deals 5 damage instead if you control a spacecraft. This, again, is one of those cards that really depends on how good spacecraft wind up being, and if you wind up playing a spacecraft main board in your lists. But if you do, I think this is probably one of the best creature removal spells at 2 mana that you can play if you don't benefit from, like, say, discarding a card to Lightning Axe. Again, you have to control a spacecraft to get the full benefit out of it, but even if you don't, it is 3 damage for 2 mana to a creature, which is a playable rate. Granted, it's only creature. It would be a lot better if it was creature or planeswalker, but I don't think it matters. If spacecraft wind up in the main deck of a red list, I think this is an auto-include as an option for removal to deal with pesky 5 toughness creatures. Next, we're going to look at Plasma Bolt. This is 1 mana for a sorcery. Plasma Bolt deals 2 damage to any target, and if you voided this turn, Plasma Bolt deals 3 damage instead. I think this is a great addition to a sort of traditional burn list that isn't playing a lot of creatures. It's kind of, in a way, almost like additional copies of Skewer the Critics, where Skewer the Critics wants you to, damage your opponent. This wants you to void. And I think is incredibly potent if you're playing it alongside cards like Shrapnel Blast. If you're going to Shrapnel Blast your opponent, congratulations, you have now voided, and if you have 1 extra mana, you're doing an additional 3 to your opponent. But it also says any target. So in a pinch, you can use this as a way to deal with some pesky creatures that your opponent's played, even if it is at sorcery speed, which means you can't really just hit their manlands very easily. I do think it is an extremely strong option for these decks that don't really care about playing creatures and just want to count to 20 as fast as possible. Next, we're going to talk about Rust Harvester, which again, I think, alongside the previous card, kind of go in this sort of mono-red artifacts matter burn list. This is 1 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature with Menace. You can pay 2 mana and tap this to exile an artifact card from your graveyard. You then put a 1/1 counter on this creature, and it deals damage equal to its power to any target. When I look at this card, I think of this as like a Grim Lavamancer, which kind of was a staple finisher card in old modern burn lists, where if you've run out of anything else, or if you've run out of cards in your hand, well, you can play a Grim Lavamancer and start exiling things from your graveyard to shock your opponent. The difference here is that, one, you have to have artifact cards in your graveyard, so it doesn't work as well with treasure tokens and things. You need to actually have artifacts in your graveyard. But the big thing is that if this doesn't get removed right away, it is doing more and more damage every time you activate its effect. Not to mention, if you cast a Monstrous Rage on this thing and then activate its ability, you could potentially be doing 5-6 damage off of one activation. I think this has a lot of potential in specific lists that use it maybe as a 2-of as a finisher, in decks that are playing artifacts to sacrifice to Shrapnel Blast. Again, alongside the previous card that we looked at, Plasma Bolt. But outside of that, I don't know how much play this sees, especially because you have to have it for a turn cycle. It has to be able to tap. And I'm sure, as any Pioneer player can attest to, things often just don't live a turn cycle. Alright, we're winding down on the red cards here. Next, we're looking at Terrapact Intimidator. This is 2 mana for a 2/1 Kavu Scout. When this creature enters, target opponent may have you create 2 lander tokens. If they don't, put 2+1/+1 counters on this creature. I think this is a very interesting card for a deck that cares about landfall, but also wants to be kind of aggressive. Because either way, you're getting something that you want. Either you're getting a 4/3 for 2 mana, which is a decent stat line for sure, or you're getting 2 lander tokens that you can, on the following couple turns, sack to ramp. Again, I don't know if this fits into any current landfall strategies, but I do think that there is potential here for some strong play lines. Next, we've got Weapons Manufacturing. This is 2 mana, 1 in a red for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token artifact you control enters, create a colorless artifact token named Munitions. With when this token leaves the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target. This is a great card that my mind is ablaze with interesting ways to break this. There are so many artifacts that you can play for cheap, for 1, 2, or even 0 mana that have strong ETBs, and that you may even want to sacrifice later on for additional strong plays that are going to make you additional tokens. I can see playing this on 2 and then a number of very cheap artifacts over the next turn, and then follow up with, casting a Brotherhood's End on yourself as a finisher to deal a ton of damage to your opponent. Also, this creates fantastic fuel for spells like, I've mentioned this already, Shrapnel Blast. It doesn't seem like adding an additional 2 mana to a Shrapnel Blast is a lot, but 7 damage for 2 mana? That's a lot of damage. That's an incredible amount of reach. Oftentimes your opponent at 7 thinks they're safe, and they might tap out to play something, and you go, donk, see ya. I mean, just off the top of my head, think about this. There is a 1 mana artifact creature from Kamigawa called Reinforced Ronin that is a 2/2 with haste. Whenever you play him at the end step, you have to return him to your hand. If you play this on turn 2, you play him on turn 1 and you get in for 2. Then you bounce him back to your hand, you play this on turn 2. Now every turn, you are swinging for 2 and creating a token that you're going to sack later to deal 2 more damage to them. It just seems like a really powerful deck, and I'm excited to brew up some aggressive artifact, maybe like an Is It artifact burn kind of thing, that can just have a lot of reach fairly easily. Moving into green, we're looking at Close Encounter. This is 2 mana, 1 in a green for an instant. As an additional cost to cast the spell, choose a creature you control or a warped creature card you own in exile. Close Encounter deals damage equal to the power of the chosen creature or card to target creature. I think this is probably one of the best bite spells that we have seen printed, maybe ever. And that's because there are so many opportunities where this is a live card. Traditional bite spells can be bad because you actually have to have a card on the battlefield in order for them to, do their thing. However, it doesn't matter if your opponent, casts a removal spell in response to this. This card is what's doing the damage. It is just referencing the creature's power. Also, with the number of strong warp cards we've seen thus far in this set, it is conceivable that you will have a cheap warp card that you're just going to leave in exile for most of the game with, 4 or maybe even 5 power that you can then use as a target for this to deal with high toughness creatures like a Shieldred or other things that green typically struggles to remove. Next up, we're going to look at Eusocial Engineering. This is a 5 cost enchantment, 3 generic and 2 green, that has landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. But the relevant part is that it warps for 2 mana, 1 and a green. We've seen a lot of these 5 mana enchantments that sort of create creatures. I think in the Final Fantasy set we saw one that creates birds that also have landfall for additional, effects. I think this is probably the best one because in a deck that wants to play a card like this, you're spending a lot of time ramping. And speaking as someone who's been playing a Temur ramp brew, I have found myself in situations where I have a lot of ramp, maybe ramp spells, maybe like a spelunking or something, and not a lot of ways to sort of protect myself from aggressive creatures in the early game. Being able to, on turn 3, warp this in for 2, and then play like a sack fetch, like one of the new Capenna lands that's going to immediately get me 2 landfall triggers, means that on turn 3, I'm able to get a pair of 2/2 blockers that can maybe stand in the way somewhat. We're talking about a format that's playing Cory Steelcutter and, Mice and Monstrous Rage, all of which have trample. But still, it allows you to get a couple of bodies on the field that can slow down the aggression coming from your opponent. And I think that matters a lot in a deck where you don't really have a lot of early cost creatures unless you're focusing on creature-based ramp. I don't know if this makes the cut into my own brews, but I do think it's an interesting choice because warp for 2 means that it's very, very accessible as a way to quickly get some bodies to block in a bad situation. Next, we're going to look at Frenzied Baloth, which is how far can we push green creatures until they actually get played? This is 2 mana, 2 green for a 3/2 beast with all of the following words. This spell cannot be countered. Trample, haste. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and combat damage can't be prevented because we've got so many fog spells flying around. I'm just going to say sorry to blue-white players. This card is nuts. It's one of those things that is going to basically get in for 3 all the time and has to be dealt with immediately, or your mono-green player is going to go gangbusters. We've seen a lot of cards like this that are just filled with keywords to try and get them to be played. Another one recently was a 1-drop with Vigilance, Reach, and Death Touch. You put all these things together, you're looking at some really, really strong boards. The biggest thing about this, though, is that it cannot be countered, and it makes your other things uncounterable. This curved into the Surok from the most recent Tarkir set that makes it so that, one, that also can't be countered even just on its own, and that lets you draw cards whenever your things are targeted. If your opponent doesn't have removal spells right away, you're getting in really, really consistently for a lot of damage. And I would be shocked if we don't see some sort of mono-green Stompy list emerge, which, purely because of this card, may actually see some viability against, some of the more reactive mid-range and control lists. Next, we're going to look at Ice-Till Explorer. This is 4 mana, 2 generic and 2 green for a 2/4 Insect Scout that says you may play an additional land on each of your turns, you may play lands from your graveyard, and has landfall whenever a land you control enters, mill a card. This thing goes crazy in a lot of these landfall decks that play Aftermath, Analyst, and Lumra, purely off the back of being able to play additional lands and then lands from your graveyard. I've played against some janky brews on Arena that have sort of played the build your own version of this by casting a turn 3 Crucible of Worlds into turn 4 the Foundation's Loot that lets you play an extra land. And while those decks largely were not very good, they had some crazy plays where they were able to play those 2 cards and then, play a new Capenna Sack Fetch, go get a land, and then play that new Capenna sack fetch from their graveyard and get another land, and then the turn after that do some crazy splendid reclamation thing. This, granted, 4 mana for a 2/4, not a great rate, but it kind of doesn't matter when you get both of these effects that are normally printed on 3 cost things. You're essentially getting 6 mana value out of a 4 mana value permanent. And whether or not it's good enough to actually make an impact is debatable. We'll see, but I'm excited to brew it, especially because, again, I've been high on these landfall strategies recently. Alright, next up we're going to look at Larval Scoutlander. This is 3 mana for a artifact spacecraft. When this enters, you may sacrifice a land or lander. If you do, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Again, I don't know how playable this is, but I'm in my landfall phase, so I'm going to talk about this card. Frankly, I think the playability of this card really depends on the playability of 2 mana cards that create lander tokens. Because this is essentially giving you a way to sack those without having to pay mana, while also getting an additional land. We don't see a lot of 3 mana get 2 land effects. There are a number of sort of like instants or creatures that do this, where you have to sacrifice a land to get 2 basics. But the fact that you can instead just sack a lander token and just go +2 and still maintain your curve is really, really strong. And there are a few 2 mana cards in this that we'll look at, I think, right after this, that create lander tokens at 2 mana. And, you know, potentially doing that, playing a 2 mana card into a lander token, this on turn 3 puts you at 6 mana on turn 4, assuming you've done no other ramping. That's not even to mention we have Arboreal Grazer in this format. So, you know, there's a lot that can be done here. Speaking of those enablers, this is Sammy's Curiosity, which is 1 mana for a sorcery. You gain 2 life and create a lander token. I think this is a really, really strong card for 1 mana. Gaining 2 life cannot be ignored in a format where, you know, mice are attacking you for like 6 damage on turn 2 or 3. And creating a lander token is an incredibly strong upside, because it means that in later turns, when you just like have these, especially in a deck playing Spelunky, I find that you wind up in these awkward situations where you've got like 1 untapped mana and nothing to do with it, or maybe 2 untapped mana and nothing to do with it because you've already cast all your 2 mana ramp spells. Being able to gain a couple life and create additional ramp opportunities off of that odd land, or crack that lander token that you made on a previous turn, means that I honestly think I'm going to put 4 of these, at least to start with, in my landfall brews, just to see how it goes, honestly. So now we're looking at multicolored cards. This is Biomechan Engineer. It is Simic colors for a 2/2. When it enters, create a lander token. And you can pay 8 mana to draw 2 cards and create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. That 8 mana activated ability is probably never going to see play. Really what this is a 2 mana 2/2 that creates a lander token. I don't know how strong this is going to be. I'm going to try it because, again, I've been brewing a Temur landfall deck, and I really like this as a 2/2 option. Currently, I'm playing the 1/1 Flying Death Touch from Ether Drift that exhausts to get you the next 2 lands from the top of your library. You sort of like discover into 2 lands and put the rest on the bottom. I don't know that this is better. I don't know that if it's worse. Flying and Death Touch is a very, very strong stat line on that creature that I'm currently playing, but if it gets removed before you can use the exhaust ability, not super great. This, even if it gets removed right away, gets you the lander token that you can then pay 2 mana to get more stuff later. It might be better, it might be worse. Not sure. I'm including it mostly because, again, I'm high on these landfall things, and I want to talk about these cards, and it's my video, so heh. Moving on to Biotech Specialist, this is Gruul Colors, 2 mana Gruul Colors for a 1/3 Insect Scientist. Again, when it enters, create a lander token. However, this has a much more relevant second line of text, which is whenever you sacrifice an artifact, this creature deals 2 damage to target opponent. I love this card. If anything, I think this is probably the more playable 2-drop lander token creation effect, because it's got a stronger but, 3 toughness is a lot better in a 2-drop than 2 toughness is. And also because my brews are playing Feckin' Green Shell, which cares about creatures that have toughness greater than power. This triggers that. So I'm super excited to play this card. I also think that this works really well with the card we talked about previously, Weapons Manufacturing, because anytime you're going to like Shrapnel Blast and sacrifice one of those munition tokens, if this guy's on the field, well, that munition token's going to do an additional 2 damage. So there's a lot of ways to sort of combine these effects together and get like a lot of damage out of just one, artifact sacrifice. Alright, next up we're talking Tenuk Memorial Ensign. This is a 3 mana 2/4, 1 generic, 1 red, 1 green, for a legendary Kavu pilot. This has landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, Tenuk deals 1 damage to each opponent. If this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, draw a card. This, I think, is probably the best of all of these landfall trigger abilities that we've seen in this set. Mostly because you have lots and lots of ways to trigger landfall exactly 2 times in a turn, to deal 1 damage to your opponent and then draw a card. I don't exactly know how the ruling on this works. I don't know if you get like 3 landfall triggers, do they all deal the 1 damage, or is it like Omnath, where like the first one deals 1 damage, the second one gets you a card, and then you just like do nothing for every other landfall trigger? Because I know that's how Omnath works with like the life gain mana and then the 4 damage, and then no matter how many other life gain triggers you get, you don't get anything else from Omnath. If this works, where it's always going to deal the 1 damage, and just on the second time you get 1 damage and a draw, this is going to be insane. Because it'll go really, really well in these like combo landfall decks that are sort of like looping their lands into and out of the graveyard over and over again. If it only happens twice, I think it still is going to be very powerful, just in like a more incremental landfall list that's going to play a lot of like small, Fabled Passage and Capenna Fetch lands to just like get a couple landfall triggers to turn into crew value over time doing that. Either way though, I can see this being a really, really strong addition to any landfall deck that plays these colors. Alright, moving into colorless cards, this is Thrumming Hive Pool, which is a 6 mana artifact that has affinity for slivers. They do exist in Pioneer, folks. This says, slivers you control have double strike and haste. At the beginning of your upkeep, create 2 1/1 colorless sliver creature tokens. So yeah, slivers exist in Pioneer. Not really good ones. There's a reason we don't have like a slivers deck running around even, at like the bottom levels. We don't have enough good slivers to make the archetype strong. I'm bringing up this card because I think this card is strong in a vacuum. I don't think you need to play slivers to play this card. I think you just need to be playing a deck that cares about wanting to have like a strong permanent that will end the game over time. I can see this as a finisher card in like a control list, particularly in Blue-White Lotus, which is going to cheat in a pair of Lotus Field with Strict Proctor or Discontinuity, and then can resolve this card, and then uptick their Teferi and untap their Lotus Field and still have like 12 mana or whatever to interact with you and keep you from removing this. The other thing that I really like about this card is that if you play multiple copies, this is making the next copy of it cheaper. So if you've drawn 2, you play this for 6, the following one's going to cost 4 if you play it on the next turn, or a couple turns later, 2 or even free, which is fantastic. Granted, if you're playing a control list, 2 or even 3 turns of this being on the field means you're probably going to win the game. But I do think it's very, very strong. Anything that like it gets printed in the future that creates changelings. I know we're going up to Lorwyn soon, and I know changelings exist on that plane. If we get something that makes cheap changeling tokens, this is going to be a lot less than 6 mana. And I'm particularly excited to play it in my existing Tamer brew, which, in addition to all of the landfall stuff that I've been talking about, also plays a few copies of Doppelgang. And maybe at that point, you just take the landfall out because this is better. Because if you Doppelgang this a bunch of times, now you're getting like a gazillion sliver tokens a turn. They all have double strike and haste. That's just like very, very, very strong, especially when you consider that I play Fecund Greenshell, which, when you have 10 or more lands, gives your whole board +2/+2. I think there's a lot to like about this card. I do think that this is going to be like $85 very, very fast, and that's because of Commander, because it can be played in like any Commander deck, and because it can go in every single Slivers deck, no problem. Alright, moving into the lands, we've got Command Bridge, which I think is really a sleeper card. I don't think people are really paying attention to how good this is. This land enters tapped. When it enters, sacrifice it unless you tap an untapped permanent you control. And you can tap this to add 1 mana of any color. Now granted, this is coming in tapped all the time unless you've got like a Splunking or a Wandering Minstrel. And we've seen other sort of like fixing lands like this, but usually the cost for this is you have to pay a mana or like bounce another land back to your hand. This is tap an untapped permanent you control. Any permanent. Permanents that potentially don't even care whether they're tapped or not. Even token permanents. There are so many ways that you can get this to enter untapped and not care. If you have a Spelunking, this is a mana confluence, end of story, that costs you no life. Because you play it, you tap the Spelunking, it's coming untapped, it's tapping for any color. I don't know that this sees like play as 4-ofs, but I do think that this land is incredible as like a turn 2 or 3 play that people are just not considering or potentially not giving enough credence to. Alright, now we're moving into these sort of like station planet lands. And I'm only going to talk about a couple of them because I think there are 2 clear standouts. And the first one here is Avendo Waking Haven. This is, again, a planet land that enters the battlefield tapped and taps for 1 green mana. But if you station it for 12+, you can pay 1 green and add 1 green for each creature you control. In general, I think this is probably not going to see a lot of play, but there is one place where I think this goes absolutely insane, and that is Elf Ball. We've seen it kind of on the fringes. I've been playing up against it on Arena a little bit here and there. In an Elf deck where you're going to be casting a Collected Company and getting potentially multiple Lords, it is going to be incredibly easy to station this to 12 and then continue playing more creatures. And then ultimately, you know, play a Creator of Behemoth, give all your stuff haste, and swing for lethal. I don't know, again, that this sees play in a lot of lists, but I think this is a incredible enabler specifically for elves. For the last card of the video, we're going to look at Uthros Titanic God Core. This land enters tapped and taps for 1 blue, but if you station it to 12+, you can pay 1 blue and tap it to add blue for each artifact you control. Like the previous land, I don't know that this makes a splash in a lot of places, but there is one that I have in mind, and that is Metalwork Colossus lists. In those decks, not only are you spamming out a ton of artifacts, you are doing so that you can cast Metalwork Colossus, an 11 power creature, for basically free. Which means, if you have this land down, you can play a Metalwork Colossus for free, and alongside any other random 1/1, I imagine you probably play a Spyglass Siren in that deck, you can then station this all the way up to 12 immediately, pay 1 blue mana, and potentially create 6, 7, 8 mana. You know, if you're also playing Simulacrum Synthesizer, which is creating a ton of those sort of constructs that get +1/+1 for each artifact you control, there is potential for some really, really explosive turns with this card in a deck that plays Metalwork Colossus. And I'm excited to see if this makes a huge impact. And I really do think it will. Well, folks, that's about all I've got to say for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. And again, if you did, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. And, you know, just advocating for Pioneer in general. It really is such a great format, and I'm hoping that we can get these videos to get some more traction, more people will see them, and we can really make a big change in how Wizards and the community sees this format. Take it easy, everybody. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you in the next one.